Good afternoon. My name is Slack Gizmo Tutorials. As you may know, my name may change depending on the day, but that's just how I roll. But today's video is going to be focused on our developer roles for the OpenFIDO application. This is going to be the first in our series of the developer track of videos, and it's going to be your initial familiarization with the application, and I'm going to walk you through essentially building the application and running it locally. There will also be subsequent videos for utilizing the CLI resource, backup and restore, and AWS deployments. The AWS deployments are going to be the hard part for most of you. I'm going to do what I can to show you what is the non-proprietary parts, as a lot of it was contracted with presence, and there will have to be modifications to your Terraform deploy code, as well as modifications to your workflows, as you may need to adjust your secrets based off of your organization for any online deployment of OpenFIDO. So with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, let us begin with our quick familiarization. So we've already seen the overall OpenFIDO repository. Now the elements we're going to need locally are going to be these four core services: our app service, auth service, workflow, and client service. And we will also be utilizing our private utilities repository, which contains some additional code for running the application. And so all of these repositories I have already cloned down into our OpenFIDO repo here. Now, once you've got all of your repositories cloned in locally, the next element that we're going to need to do is we're going to want to essentially follow along our walkthrough in our app service. The app service contains a pretty solid walkthrough on how to build the application, and I'm just essentially going to go through this with you live. And so this is essentially what is used for you to build and actively develop or contribute to the OpenFIDO application itself. If you intend to be a contributor, you will need to be added into the organization, and to follow along with the process for that, you can just reach out to generally any of our resources listed here for OpenFIDO itself, where you can email our support, or you can reach out to one of our currently active team members, and we will try and help you get set up. Otherwise, you can fork our repositories, as this is mostly open source, and you can submit pull requests, you can submit issues, a variety of different ways of trying to contribute within the organization. So let's go, and we have already become a member here. We're just first time coming in to work on OpenFIDO, or first time contributor, and we want to build this. So the first commands that we're going to want is using our export Docker build kit and compose Docker build value set to 1. These environment variables essentially help our Docker compose utilize certain arguments and build keys along the way that will help us build the application. So we'll take these commands, and we shall now run them here in our application. So in order to run, we're going to want to be running from within our OpenFIDO app service repository. Keep in mind that these steps will differ quite a lot for once we do a demo of the CLI version in a separate video. So we run each of our exports and get that set up. Then the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to use this handy cp command. This is why I had everything built within our local structure within the same essentially directory, because it allows for an easy set of commands. You just go back up one into OpenFIDO auth service, and we'll just take the environment example and it's going to copy it on over as our auth environment. So once we do that, we can actually take a look at our file that we've gotten here. And that's just going to be our auth environment. A lot of these items are going to be empty, but some core ones would be like building locally. You want to have localhost 3000 as our client's URL so it knows where to look. And then some core information for our email service here. However, we don't need to make any adjustments to that, because the email service, you don't need to email off of your local version. And our deployed version is using a proprietary emailing system, so unfortunately I can't share much more about that with you. So now we can move on to our next step. So we're going to also need to create a worker environment variable, and in the auth service they're going to need to have just a general env. So we'll run these commands here. And here. You might be wondering why we need all these environment variables, and it's because part of the Docker building process, a lot of these will start getting populated automatically with the relevant information needed to support these services. And so finally, we're going to need to run our Docker Compose build here, and it's going to be taking a build argument using your SSH private key, which is going to be an ID RSA. To make an ID RSA, you're going to need to essentially build one of those and connect it with your GitHub account, because this is what's going to give you permission to pull the utilities repository locally and use it when building OpenFIDO. And since that's a private repository, it needs your GitHub authorization access. And there are a few different little hoops that you might run into along the way here, because SSH utilizes port 22. And so if you're doing this at home, you might have some local firewall issues blocking it. I've run into that one myself. You could also have issues. ISPs will generally block port 22 access by default for most home internet systems, and you have to contact them to have it lifted. And then if you're outside either of those common issues, there's other things that might cause SSH issues. And just make sure that you've got appropriate access rights even through GitHub. Now for me, I'm using my virtual machine, and I've gotten my ID RSA already saved locally here. So that build arg is going to grab my ID RSA key when it runs this build. Right, and I also use sudo because that's how Docker is on this. And so now it's going to essentially go through and build all of the images that it needs. So while this is running through, we can take the opportunity to just take a quick look over at our Docker files and Docker Compose, because these are going to be the core files essentially for these commands. So there's our Docker Compose YAML. This one decided to mess with me. There we go. So for our Docker file, you can essentially see a lot of our environment setup for where we're going to have our APIs, for our app service. So the app service runs on port 5000. We already saw that our client's going to run on port 3000. We also get a blob storage that runs on port 9000 for our local builds. Now for our current style, it's using pipenv to do its build and lock. However, I have actually worked on updating it, and so when we look at what this file's now running, and this is what's running locally, we have changed over to using a virtual environment with venv module. It's a little more stable and easier to use than pipenv. And so I essentially use that to source and install my requirements based off of requirements.txt file. It's a lot easier to see what you need, a lot easier to update it. I prefer it greatly over pipenv, and so that's going to be our official method. And as we go through here, you're going to see where we're going to need to use our private key and add it in and add our key scan. Now, the reason why this is needed is that if we go to our requirements.txt file, many of you might learn a fun thing from this, some of you might not, depending on your level of knowledge coming in. You could actually have a command to get and then pip install a repository and add that in directly into a requirements.txt file, and pip will try and connect with your repository account to download and install it. Super cool, super nifty, very useful. So let's go back now that we've taken a look at our Docker file. Let's take a look at our Docker Compose file. That's the big one that we've run. And so what this does is essentially it will set up and run the Docker files from each of our different repositories. As you can see, it's all based off of everything run within the same directory, so it goes up and into the workflow service. Then it can go into any of our other services. We've got a few others. There's our auth service that it builds, the app service. It's a pretty complete form, and you run this within the app service. So we can come back here, and we see the build is still in progress. The first time build always takes a little while, and then just re-upping it tends to be a lot faster because Docker has a lot of caching that is set up. Yeah, you can see the venv system I've got going here. So this will take a few, but for the intent of this video, this one is going to certainly be a longer run because I intend to show the entirety of the build process. Not to mention I've got full faith in your ability to skip on the tracking bar if ever you got tired of watching any of this and had a specific target of something you wanted to see at some point. Oh. This was, I can get rid of that sleep. It's actually a nice little catch there. That's a little command I use while building and developing myself. Sometimes if I want to have a chance to actually read something, a lot of this you can see moves pretty fast, and being able to go back up. If the taskbar moves way too quick, you see how it's kind of moving up here. On some systems it might run incredibly fast, and when it's going at that rate, before you know it, you're going to lose the logs. So anytime there's something I want to see clearly, I'll toss a sleep on there. All right, so at this point we can see that the build has finished for our first stage. Now we've got a couple of additional things that we're going to need to do. So now that we've done our main build, the rest of these steps tend to run a little faster. We are going to want to do our upgrades for the system. So these will essentially help set up and upgrade our database and prep any of our other database structures for each of our different services. It uses Minio and Flask, and they've got some different revisions saved with Alembic in a very convoluted system that will take you a little time to understand if you have not already worked with those systems before. I'm not going to be doing an instructional on how all of those necessarily work, as that would take far more time than I've actually got available. We're just going to run through and do the rest of our upgrades here. I also keep an eye on the time. Right. Sudo. Yeah, it'd be easy enough to grant Docker its full, powerful default sudo abilities, but since I'm running this on a virtual machine in a Linux box, I just have not actually set that up. On your host machine, you're probably going to want to have Docker properly configured. I do like to use my virtual machines just in case anything for the case of development gets really wonky, because then you can just wipe the entire machine without a worry in the world. Alright, so these next commands are going to build our access tokens and store them in those environment variables that we created earlier. And so that's just an additional layer of communication security in the application. So if you're running it locally or you're running it online, you'll just get multiple layers of security in the application. It's quite handy. Now granted, it's not the only layer of security, but an additional one. The rest of our security measures I will be keeping under wraps. Alright, so this step is an important one, and you want to make sure you read the instructions on it about saving the React API token that we're going to be generating here. We will be needing that shortly. And so once this is done, we get our API token here. And this is going to get used in our OpenFIDO client. This will go into our source config index.js. did not do that right. src config index.js. And then this code will go into, right, I am using an environment system here for our React App API token. That needs to be updated. So we're going to turn our example.env.txt to a .env or to an env. File, and in our env we shall replace our token. That was another update I did, and I just need to update the documentation on it. So now that that has been done, I'm going to pause this recording. And so now that we've got our client key and we have updated it, we can now move to the next step. So now we're going to want to create our admin user for our local instantiation here. And so this is going to, almost forgot my sudo again, spin up the Python shell within our app that's running our database. And so from here, we'll be able to now essentially import some necessary details to be able to create our user. So first, import our services. We create the user. Set the user to system admin. And commit the session. And so that now has added up our new admin user that we'll use in our local instance. And you can set these settings to whichever one you want. So if you want to use an actual email, you can. You can update the password. Although I do believe these two tags, admin and user, you are going to also want to keep there. So essentially you'd only want to change these two tags. So now that our user's been created, we can finally run our final command, which is to bring the services up. And so after this spins up the services, we are going to then want to spin up our front end, and then that will be the end of our demonstration here. And so you're going to know that this element is done spinning up our back end when you see the heartbeat running. So now that you see our heartbeat here, we know that we've got the back end, and that's going to be needed to run our front end. So to run the front end, first we are going to want to go to our OpenFIDO client. So the next thing we're going to want to do is run our npm install, because the front end is going to come with a long variety of node packages that you're going to need to run the front end. And so a lot of times that front end step is forgotten, so always remember to do an install. So as you can see, we do need a lot of packages local for this client. Now, if you really hated yourself, you could always do an npm install globally. That way you wouldn't need to reinstall per repository, but that's generally bad practice outside of a virtual machine, because that can impact all kinds of development materials. So unless you're certain it's something that you want global, you generally wouldn't want to do that. So now that our client's fixed, then the only other thing we need to do is npm start. And it's going to start up our development server. So give it just another minute here for it to finish up. It is eating up quite a bit of CPU on my virtual machine here. So it's going to take a little minute. So virtual machines sometimes do run a little slow for this. I may need to up the data power of my virtual machine for this instance. All right, there we go. It's finished processing, and so now we've got our application here. So now we can just log in to admin@example.com. You can see I've done this already before as a test run. And it will come with my password, which is going to be 123456789. That's the one I set. And I can sign in. Now note that I don't have access to any of the other tabs here yet. That's because the first thing you got to do is add an organization. And so once you get an organization, you can then see user and pipelines, and you can do invites. Granted, off of the local, invites are pointless, but invites are what you would use on a deployed to, say, AWS application. And so, yeah, we have our OpenFIDO application here. We can even go in, add our pipeline, and go through and utilize our run functionality. And just like do what we need to do. Most new users will already come with an organization. This is just for a first time setup or a local setup that you'll need to manually input a user and add an organization to them. So yeah, that is our getting started familiarization for the developer track, and that is how you would build OpenFIDO from scratch to start developing on it. So if you want to update the client, those updates would go into the OpenFIDO client repository, and then the other 3 repositories for auth, app, and workflow services would handle a lot of the back-end elements. Now, unlike the client, which you can do some live updates with that and then see some of the changes, you will not be able to do the same thing for the back end. You would essentially have to rebuild them. So that concludes this video for our tutorial. And so the follow-on video that you can expect will then be setting up and running from the OpenFIDO CLI and utilizing database backups. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.